All right, good afternoon again. This is Adam Jacobs with the City of Boston. We're going to go ahead and get started. I think we're going to get some more beeps as we keep going here. So we have everybody on mute right now, and if you have any questions, you can send them through the chat to the organizers, and we can let you know. So if anything goes wrong with the webinar along the way, just let us know, and we'll do what we can to get to it as quick as possible. Again, this is Adam Jacobs, and I'm here with a number of other folks from Boston's energy team, and Zach Bloom from Competitive Energy Services, who's been helping us get this set up and off the ground. And looks like we've got a lot of people on the line. So again, if you want to just make sure that you're on mute, you should automatically be muted, but it'll just make things a lot easier. All right, so really quickly, we're just going to have a quick introduction from our friends at Competitive Energy Services to just give a quick overview as to the state of play as it relates to power purchase agreements in general. So Andy, you want to take it away? Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
Yeah, great. Andy Price from Competitive Energy Services. Thanks for joining, everybody. Just by way of a quick introduction, we're showing a slide here that some of you may have seen from Rocky Mountain Institute. Showing this slide for a couple of reasons. It shows a fair amount of corporate VPPA activity over the past several years. What's striking about this slide is that there aren't any municipals shown. So this RFI initiative led by the City of Boston is looking to change that. The other reason to show it is the relative size of this RFI, as we'll talk about in more detail. Close to 6 million megawatt hours a year currently across 20 cities. Remains to be seen what the final load will be out of any procurement, but given the different technologies that will be considered wind versus solar, and it could be a significant portion of the annual corporate VPP activity that we've seen historically. So this is a very exciting initiative, and I just wanted to put it in context in terms of the corporate VPP activity we've seen over the past several years.
Thanks, Andy. So as a quick way of background, this slide is just showing largely the collective power of cities and their mayors to demonstrate action on policies related to energy and climate change. We largely took this initiative up with some inspiration from two different things, one being in January of 2017, Los Angeles and Mayor Garcetti did a great job in pooling a group of cities to put out a request for information for electric vehicles. And the result of that was that they identified demand for over 100,000 EVs from municipal fleets across the country, estimated $10 billion and worth of assets. And they received 40 responses across all vehicle asset classes. So they got a lot of interest, showed that cities really do have a lot of buying power. And last I heard from the folks from LA, they're moving ahead with a formal buying group, though I'll leave it to them to speak to that more outside of this. In June of last year, as you obviously know, President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, but almost immediately 400 U.S. mayors from around the country jumped in and basically, continued and showed their commitment toward the Paris Climate Accord and said that, we'll largely try and make up the difference. And then just in June of this year, on June 7th, Mayor Walsh hosted an International Mayors Climate Summit and a lot of mayors from around the country and actually around the world attended and talked about various things their cities were doing to help address, both mitigate and adapt to the challenges of climate change. And at that conference, Mayor Walsh announced this initiative that we're now working on today. So if you can go to the next slide, Andy. So again, in May, we started laying the groundwork and having some staff level discussions with our partner cities and figuring out, who was interested in participating, what their electric load looked like, what goals they had towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. On June 7th, Mayor Walsh announced the summit, and right now we're in the phase of, obviously the RFI went out, and we're hosting this webinar to answer any questions people have about it. And then the hope is that we'll have the results back in. Obviously, the end of August is the close of the RFI and when we'll be accepting responses until. But our hope is that we'll have some information that we can aggregate and then briefly talk about, or have our mayor or a partner city mayor talk about at Governor Brown's Climate Action Summit in September. And that's largely the sort of broader timeline, but the next slide gives more specifics on the actual timeline of the RFI itself. Oh, sorry, I misspoke there. Quickly, just looking at the cities that we have pooled here, we have 20 different cities from different geographies covering almost every RTO and ISO in the country. We've got a smattering of municipalities from the Northeast, but we also have folks down in the South, in the Midwest, and out on the West Coast. And, as Andy mentioned earlier, we're close to about 6 million megawatt hours a year in electric load. And this is just related to municipal operations in these respective cities. So I know Boston is one of the largest electric consumers in the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that is. And, this is just a good indication that cities really are some of the largest, electric consumers and really just largest property owning entities in a lot of regions around the country. And now back to the RFI timeline itself. As mentioned, it went out on July 31st. We have the webinar now. We'll be posting the recording of the webinar to boston.gov, the same link that you use to get to download the RFI itself. And that will be posted by the end of this week at 5 p.m. Eastern. It'll be a link to a YouTube video, and then we'll also have a write-up answering any questions we're not able to get to today. And then the responses for the RFI are going to be due at the end of this month, August 31st, by 5 p.m. Eastern. So the responses themselves, this is all straight out of the RFI, but for those who haven't had a chance to dig into it, or if you, just need the reminder for it, responses should be emailed to me, and that's my email address right there, as well as Zach Bloom from CES. And if you could just make things easier for us, use that subject line. So put in the organization's name and then response to multi-city renewable energy purchase RFI. That'll make it a lot easier for us to collect the responses and quickly aggregate them. And you should send those with the attachments being, attachment 1 is the primary thing we're asking for, which is the Excel sheet that has a number of different components that we're asking about the respective projects. But we also understand that entities may want to submit additional documentation, and those will be accepted and reviewed as time allows. The primary focus is going to be that Excel document, but if you have other things you'd like to send along in the email, feel free to do so. And again, that will be due August 31st by 5 p.m. Eastern. So again, for developers, primarily we are interested in the projects that you're all working on. You have a lot of exciting things going on out there, and we'd love to hear about them. Include as much of the information as you are willing to share on these projects. For non-developers, so if you are some form of research institution or broker or someone else who wouldn't categorize yourself as a developer, fill out as much of attachment 1 as you possibly can. And again, we are allowing for that, if you have additional documentation you'd like to submit, whether it's, a market report on pricing or something to that effect, as time allows, we will review it, but understanding that we're going to get a lot of interest from this and a lot of responses, and that we have a relatively quick timeline we're working on. We do ask that, if possible, you go through the Excel attachment, and other documentation will be reviewed as time allows, and that all respondents section down at the bottom basically just covers that again. So we've received a couple of questions about the attachment 1, and I don't know if Zach, do you want to speak to this at all, just sort of to outline it? But I mean, some of the first page stuff makes sense. It's pretty basic, just contact information.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So the intent here is just to go briefly through the attachment 1 and the 4 separate worksheets. We want to leave at least a half an hour for developers to ask questions. And so what we're going to ask is that once we get to the end for Q&A, if you have any questions, go into the chat dialogue and send it directly to the organizers. We've already gotten a few questions about if the decks will be made available. So it will be part of the recording. So all the materials will be posted to the Boston website. So starting here on the first worksheet, this is for respondent and project information. And so the respondent information is pretty generic, as is the project information. This is really pertaining to the specific project name, what the interconnection status is, unique project details, or any other relevant details related to permitting.
And one question that was asked from a few developers, if you have a few projects that you'd like to submit through the RFI, we just ask that you save separate Excel sheets so we can evaluate them separately, but obviously all of your respondent information and contact details can be carried over from project to project.
And so attachment 2 here gets into more specific details, like what is the capacity in DC, what's the technology, is it solar, is it wind, is it hydro, what's the annual expected generation in megawatt hours, and the expected commercial operations date. Also, please provide the hub pricing as well as the lat and longitude. And so we'll give you, to Adam's point here, if you want to present multiple projects or one project with multiple tenors or hub locations, please just change the naming convention to specify what's changing relative to your base bid. So I want to spend a little bit of time here in addition on the pricing. So a lot of these towns and cities are really looking at this as a way to meet their carbon neutrality goals. They want to do so in a cost-effective manner. And so to the extent that you guys are willing to offer specific provisions like curtailment below zero, so there's no negative out-of-pocket, or some sort of upside shares, we've provided additional cells here so that, for instance, if you were to keep 25% of the upside benefit, then what would you change or reduce your pricing to accordingly? So this is in the spirit of kind of increasing the ability to do projects without limiting actual project beneficiaries. And so this has 4 kind of separate locations, anything under zero for hub pricing, or 25, 50, and 75% upside share with the developer. All of these are based on, go next slide, Andy, on a P90 profile. So we've also gotten questions from developers, and so we're looking for the 8760 profile that says this is what hourly based on the weather file looks like. But if you also want to provide additional pricing for a P50 or something else, do so, but you need to submit the P90 as the baseline, which is what we're going to use for the apples to apples comparison across all these projects, developers, and ISOs. And then the last slide here is attachment 4, and this is related to the historical hub pricing. And so most hubs here should have, from 2013 to 2017, historical hub pricing. We know there's certain locations out in Southern Power Pool or others that don't have that full 5-year. And so please provide whatever is publicly available for that hub location in the event that you don't have the full 5-year trend. But looking for this, once again, on the 8760, so breaking down by month, day, hour from 2013 to 2017.
All right, thanks, Zach. So we really did want to leave this as the opportunity to go through questions. So just some quick housekeeping stuff before we get into those questions. As Zach mentioned, the webinar recording is going to be available on the boston.gov website, the same place where you downloaded the RFI this Friday by the end of the day. As for follow-up communications, we really are hoping to get as many questions as we can through the chat box right now and go through those. We'll obviously make those available as it comes up. And basically, if there's anything that we don't have answers to right now, we can get to those later on. We'll have a written document if there's something that we need to give follow-up on, but primarily we're planning on going through those today. So looking at some of the questions here, someone already asked and we already answered, is it going to be available after the call? Yes, in the form of a recording. So we don't plan on publishing the slides, but the recording will be there. Are renewable energy sites in neighboring jurisdictions to ISO New England eligible for the RFI and ultimately the RFP? Well, the first thing to that is that, there is no guarantee that there will be an RFP. As of right now, these cities have signed on for this request for information to determine whether or not this is something we're going to go ahead with to begin with. So that's sort of, to address the second part of the question. As for the first, we really are interested in projects that will generate renewable energy and additionality and offset carbon emissions. So, to the extent that a project is in a neighboring jurisdiction, neighboring to who, I guess, we're going to have cities from all over the country. And therefore, if you have a project in some additional geography, it's definitely worth evaluating. And if you want to submit something to that, we would entertain, reviewing something like that. There's a question here on whether or not the responses will be exempt from the Freedom of Information Act disclosures. We listed in the RFI a link to guidelines on Massachusetts public disclosure laws. And we also mentioned that additional jurisdictions may apply, given that we have cities from a number of other states. And as soon as we share the results of the RFI with them, that is foilable as well. So, to the extent that, you are willing to share information, please do. But, there's no guarantee that there is an RFP down the road. We hope that we'll get to that in the future, but we don't have any intent of withholding, information for any period of time. There's another question here from Marco asking about hub settlement pricing and how that would work in places like Arizona, Florida, or Georgia, where there are no markets. Zach, do you have any thought to that?
Yeah, I think the projects here that, for instance, the city of Orlando is interested in, all of these would be predicated on having open and transparent markets. There might be some additional information that you can provide for a green tariff program or some other that could make sense for them, but primarily they would be in ISOs that have hubs that are public and transparent. And so they're not necessarily looking for projects in the city of Orlando or the local area. They would also consider things in Texas, in PJM, and Southern Power Pool. It's really going to come down to the additionality, the economics, and the ability to reduce carbon emissions.
Another question here, are you requesting pricing for P50 or P90? I know Zach mentioned earlier, we've asked for P90, but if P50 is what you have, we can work with that as well.
But the baseline request for the apples to apples comparison is to provide anything for P90 and then an alternative where you provide P50.
Great. Yep. Another question here, is the intention to have all the cities purchase a slice of a single project? We honestly have not gotten that far along in the evaluation of how exactly this would work. You could picture a few different scenarios in which, you know, a consortium or buying group could go out and invest in a series of projects. You could have scenarios in which, you know, it might be, you know, one anchor city primarily investing more or less in one project than in another. But, you know, the overall intention of it, you know, at this point, we're really just requesting information so that we can start thinking about those sort of considerations as a group. But, you know, it's something that, you know, it's a good question, something that we'll have to get further along down into. Let's see. What is mechanism for evaluating the value of RECs in the procurement? Also, how would large hydro be evaluated with regards to RECs? You know, I think you know, we would be looking at, obviously, you know, since we're talking about additionality, ideally RECs from new projects or expansion of existing projects, so new renewable generation that was not there before. I guess, you know, the hydro question, that's something that, you know, I know hydro is part of New England's plans for meeting some clean energy goals. I don't want to speak for other cities, though I know, you know, many of them have engaged in some form of hydro procurement. But, you know, again, I would encourage to include more information and not less. Is there interest in the wholesale PPA with retail supply offer, and is on-site behind-the-meter renewable generation of interest? Yes and yes. Let's see. Does the RFI contemplate a target in-service date, as replies will be much influenced by the year in service? Well, I guess just for Boston's example, we have goals reaching out to 2050 for greenhouse gas reductions, and we plan to be carbon neutral by then. And understanding that it would be very difficult to execute a single contract for a single project that would cover all of our load, you know, it's likely that there will be a series of projects that would have different in-service dates. So, you know, sooner is obviously better, but I think, you know, as this initiative progresses further and these, you know, if a buying group materializes and we go out for a number of transactions, you know, there's 20-year deals, and there's probably, you know, there's about 32 years between now and 2050 when we're hitting our goals. So I think, you know, obviously time would be, you know, dictating closer than later, but I don't think, you know, if you had a project that wouldn't be in service until 2025, that we wouldn't look at it. That would still, you know, certainly fit within a, you know, goal of reducing emissions by 2050. And that's not to say that, you know, once we get to 2050, we're going to, you know, pat ourselves on the back and call it a day. I think there'll be a lot of work to be done after that. So even if your project is further out and the tail end of it extends past 2050, that's still something we'd like to hear about. Someone asked, does storage qualify as a resource? Storage in itself, maybe not, but solar in storage or wind in storage, that certainly could create a compelling project. Someone asked, could we define additionality? And I think we got at that, but essentially, you know, new renewable energy generation. You know, we would not necessarily be looking at unbundled RECs as part of this. You know, that's something that's a market that we can all access on our own right now. But I think the idea is that we would like to identify new projects that are not in existence yet, or I guess the expansion of an existing project to create additional generation that would require some, you know, capital input to make that happen. Basically anything that, you know, allows these cities to be a prime mover so that we could have legitimate claims that we have, you know, enabled the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Someone asked about, do you anticipate actually transacting and selecting a winning bidder? Obviously, that's not part of a request for information, but if we ever did go out with a request for proposal, that would be how that would work. So at this point in time, again, this is a group of cities hoping to sort of, evaluate what the market looks like and hopefully, allow the market to get a little more information as to, what we're looking at and, what the scale of our, load would look like. But, there is not going to be a winning bidder as part of this process at this point in time because we're not requesting proposals. Who would the counterpart to the supplier be in a BPPA and provide the required securities? The cities themselves, and yes, it would be the cities engaging in contracts with the developers. It might be that, there's a single developer and a handful of cities engaging in discrete transactions, but that those cities would have some form of memorandum of agreement to, go in on the same project as part of their, simultaneous RFPs. We got another question. Will it be possible for more towns and cities to join in the RFP? Again, there is no RFP at this point in time, but we do hope that this initiative will attract additional cities and additional load. We're at 20 right now, and that's, 6 terawatt hours, but we would love to have it be, 40 cities and, 20 terawatt hours or whatever it might be. So yeah, we're certainly still open to calling for, more cities to participate in this. And I know there are a handful that we're hoping to get approval to participate in this phase that, said, we couldn't get the okay in time, but we would love to, get more information as this initiative progresses. So, yeah, definitely more cities can and likely will be included later on down the road. Someone asked a question about technology that is 0 GHG but is not covered under the RPS program. Again, all I could say is, if you're interested in us evaluating something, provide as much detail as you can on it. We can't evaluate something we don't see, so we would definitely review it, and it would be part of the RFI process that we would take a look at, and I'd encourage you to include that info. This is a question I got from a number of people before this, and I'm glad that someone asked it now so I can address it to the wider audience. Is response to the RFI conditional for participating in a future RFP? No, you don't need to respond in the RFI. That being said, the intent of the RFI is to evaluate this market and determine whether or not this is something these cities are going to go ahead with to begin with. So, a future RFP is not guaranteed, and we are hoping that by getting a robust, response from developers, that this can be enough for us to, turn around and bring to our budget directors and mayors and say, look, these are all the vendors who have expressed interest in doing business with the cities. And, yeah, so, I think that would largely, it'll be contingent on how great a response we get from this. And judging by the number of people on this webinar, I think there is a really strong interest, so that's encouraging. After this RFI, do you have a timeline for the first procurement in a future RFP? We don't have an exact timeline in mind for it. I would imagine, after we go through the process of, reviewing the RFI responses and, having some discussions with the cities who are participants and any other cities who would like to join, we'll probably, start thinking about a future RFP if that is, the road we're going down. I would imagine that would be developed potentially sometime in the next year or so. So that would be, definitely not until 2019, but, I can't put a timeline on something that's hypothetical at this point, but, I can't foresee it going too far beyond that because we have briefed a number of these cities, at least to the point that, they should have some understanding, and our own, internally we've had with our budget office discussions so that they know it's coming. Let's see. Is the RFI ultimately seeking firm energy volumes, hence the request for P90 Gen? Zach, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the P90 is first to assess the economics based on generation profiles that are expected, but also to tie back to a percentage of offtake. And so a lot of the cities are growing, whether it's EVs, new buildings, they're also changing their energy generation systems. And so this is to be able to tie to how much of their scope 2 emissions comes from electricity, and thus how much they should be off-takers for.
Yep. Someone asked, how are you prioritizing or assessing geography, and is there preference given to different cities? Personally, I think if it was right outside of Boston, we would love that, but no, I think every city is going to have, some indication that they would love to have projects close to home that they could point to and have their mayor show up and cut a ribbon at. But, understanding that the whole intent of this is to evaluate opportunities more broadly. At this point in time, we have no preference towards regional geography, and the intent of this RFI is to just get that exact information, what is out there and where is it. So, definitely don't feel discouraged to respond if your projects are nowhere near any of the participant cities. This is a new, exercise for us as municipalities to look into a virtual procurement, but that's not to say that, if your project happens to be located near one of the participant cities, it could be virtual for a handful of cities and, actual delivery of power for other cities. So, again, it's not something that we've determined at this point. We didn't, put a scope of work into an RFP. We're putting out a request for information with the hopes that folks in the development community will be able to share valuable information that can help shape that future procurement. Someone asked, are you asking for project details that are currently in development, or would we want you to respond with completed projects in relevant regions? I honestly think, both of those would be valuable. So if you have things in development that you have details that you're able to share at this time, great. If you've recently put projects out and have actually, put into service, a project that you think would be useful for us to see, I think, an example of a real world project would be very valuable. So if you'd like to share details on recently completed projects, just mark it as such in the details on that first tab. But yeah, we'd love to see information on that too, because, the best we get to see is usually, some aggregated market report that gives you information as to, a whole slew of projects. But if you have a specific one in mind that, you think is illustrative of what could be out there for a consortium of cities, I think that would be valuable information as well. Preference to the type of rec, project versus Green E. We haven't identified any preference at this point, between all of the cities. I think, again, it's sort of figuring out what's out there and what's available to us. So I think, again, no preference.
The pricing structure that we're asking for on the bids would be with the assumption that the cities retain the energy and the environmental attributes. And so if they want to retire them to make their carbon claim, there is really no value there. There's an implied value. And if they decide to arbitrage them on their own, then they could sell them into the market and then go buy replacement RECs. But I think that's a long-term decision discussion for the cities that won't really be considered much at this point.
Thanks, Zach. Someone asked a good question, and I think we touched on it a little bit before, but they asked, is this, we mentioned Massachusetts public disclosure laws, but as noted in the RFI, we are going to be sharing the information with the participant cities, and therefore, their public disclosure laws will also apply. Anything we share with them, will be subject to, say, Illinois or Florida or Texas public disclosure law. I think we're getting towards the bottom of the list here. Settlement prices. How much consideration given to upside sharing levels versus fixed price? Is submitting upside sharing prices optional? Yes, it is optional. And then, considering that versus fixed price, again, it's one that we haven't identified preference for, but this is all about evaluating what our options are. Knowing that municipalities are generally risk averse, there are instances where we'd be willing to share the upside in order to shield ourselves from some of the downside. And I think that's largely what, that tab is meant to capture. So, if you have the same project and you'd like to look at it multiple ways, you can share that information. I have a question here. For cities in vertically integrated markets like Arizona, how are the cities working with incumbent utilities to procure a renewable energy project? I think our friend from Phoenix would be able to, think about that one a little bit further. But I think this is looking at the potential for a virtual project. So it might not mean that we're taking physical delivery of the energy, in which case you would not necessarily need to think about, the incumbent utility and the fact that it's vertically integrated. So, it's essentially an investment in a project for the ability to claim additionality by retiring RECs. But yeah, I think that's largely getting at that one. And it looks like, from what I see here, that is close to the bottom of the question list. So, we had another question. When you ask for relevant project details, are you asking for information on projects? Oh, no, actually, we did go through this one. And looks like that's been covered. Would you be open to bundling developments with retail electric supply delivered to the meter? Is on-site BTM solar an option? Yeah, I think, again, we're fairly open to different opportunities at this point. And unless we're mistaken, I think that gets to the end of the questions. We'll leave this open for another few minutes just so anyone who's thinking of some last-minute ones can throw them in, and we'll continue to, we'll continue to stay on the line and answer questions. But if you're all set, then the webinar recording will be posted. So if you miss anything and there's other questions, we can get to them. So we are still getting some questions, and as I said, we're going to stay on and answer them as they come. Would a city sign a VPPA with a Canadian project? We'd have to look at it. So, if you want us to evaluate it, please do submit it, and we can, evaluate it as it comes in. Someone asked again, they might have been late to this, if a company doesn't participate in the RFI, can they participate in an RFP? And, again, there's no guarantee that there will be an RFP, and if there is one, you wouldn't be precluded because you didn't participate in the RFI. So we got a question about explaining again the pricing information and price variations on the second table, probably mostly about the upside component to it. So Zach, if you want to just go through that one again really quickly.
Yeah, so the baseline assumption here is, whether it's a 10, 15, or 20-year term, you specify the term, and then the assumption would be the baseline hub settlement price with no escalator. And so you're specifying what your PPA rate would be without an escalator, and the additional 4 scenarios are showing 1, no settlement below $0. And so if the L&P market drops below 0, then you're not getting that negative for the city, and so you might charge a slight premium for that. Or in the scenario where there's upside, what would you reduce the baseline from if they share 25% of the upside, 50%, or 75%? So once again, a lot of these cities aren't doing this to make money. They're doing this for environmental reasons, for additionality, and to meet their carbon neutrality goals. And to the extent you can offer a structure that limits their risk and allows the other criteria to be met, it's definitely something that would be considered.
Is there additional monthly summary data or facility information available to better estimate on-site opportunities? I can't speak for other cities, but for Boston, I know that the data.boston.gov has a lot of information on our energy usage for on-site. We have actually monthly utility bills for every single one of our accounts posted there. I think that would not be something we're looking for in this RFI necessarily because it's only relevant to us. But, other cities may have additional on-site information about their facilities. But again, note that this is a multiple city project looking to evaluate large scale renewable energy projects. And, we all have separate initiatives for our on-site procurements. So again, we're going to leave the line open, but unless there's other questions, thanks again for joining, and appreciate all the interest in this initiative. It's really exciting. So we're looking forward to seeing everyone's responses in the RFI. Another question that came in, is ultimate procurement going to be done by the city and not through a broker acting for all cities? We have not gotten that far in evaluating our options. Again, there is no ultimate procurement just yet. This is a request for information, and those would be decisions we'd have to make some point in the future as a group. I have another question here. Will Boston or any of the other cities enter into contracts prior to deciding if an RFP will be conducted? Is there a standstill for these cities in the meantime? I can't speak for other cities. I know that we don't have any intentions of going out to bid for off-site renewables outside of this. But yeah, I can't speak for other cities. I would imagine some of them do have some projects in the works, but we came together as a group of cities with the intent of aggregating a larger load that would attract a lot of attention from developers, which, clearly we're successful in that because the interest in this webinar and the number of questions we've had. So again, Boston is not planning on issuing any RFPs in the near future for off-site renewables. I can't speak for the other cities though. All right, it's been about 10 minutes since our last question, so we're going to close up shop here. Thanks everyone for joining again, and have a great day.